Chapter 13, Hunted Gatherers. The 72 hours passed uneventfully. Gathering food remained the only real problem. On the third day, the fish didn't bite, the snares sat empty, and they cleaned out the blueberry bushes. Even Harold became restless, loping off on forays of his own. So when the sunset started its fourth full orbit around them, they laid out their tent and sleeping bag to dry. They'd been using it unzipped as a blanket, and ate some cold Pop-Tarts. Once they broke camp and gathered everything, Cole shouldered the pack, and they began their trek downstream, each munching a single piece of beef jerky. At first, the going was pretty easy. They averaged probably 12 or 14 miles in a 10-hour span. Byron fished before breakfast and also while Cole set up camp. The ground didn't reveal a single worm, but they caught grasshoppers and crickets as they walked and popped them inside the folding mess kit for safekeeping. They worked well as bait. Meanwhile, the stream continued to get deeper and wider, and they caught bigger and more filling fish. They were already getting sick of fish. They'd seen some wildlife, a few deer and what looked like a grizzly across the stream, and a lot of birds, especially crows and ravens, but as of yet, no people. It was all surprisingly normal. While fishing, a few days into their journey, Byron felt sure he'd seen a brown-hatted elf beside the stream, but when he opened his mouth to call out, it vanished, leaving him to question whether it had been a figment of his imagination or not. They did, however, get a clear view of a strange predator toward the end of a daily hike. "Get down!" Cole shouted, tackling his brother. A shadow darkened the grass, and Byron looked up to see what can only be described as a griffin passing overhead. It cried out, a deep, resonant, raptor-like roar that echoed off the trees. The eagle-lion hybrid probably measured about 7 feet long in body, and twice that in wingspan. It curled both its front talons and rear paws while flying, steering through the use of wings and a fan of feathers splayed out at the end of its long, cat-like tail. Harold began to bark and growl. At the sound, the doe and 2 fawns bolted from the deep grass on the far side of the river, running toward the shelter of the trees. The griffin changed flight angles and dove, catching one of the fawns in its talons and then raking it repeatedly with the rear claws. Cole grabbed Harold by the collar, shushing him and dragging him away from the stream and toward the woods, where he sat on Cole's lap while he rubbed the dog's ears, whispering to him calmly. A few moments later, the griffin took off, the limp fawn dangling from its talons, and disappeared over the forest toward the snow-capped mountains. Well, Cole joked, that was comforting. He released Harold, who ran to the stream and swam across to sniff the area and lick up some spilled blood. "Yeah," Byron nodded, flexing the fingers in his left hand. His arm didn't hurt much anymore, and the cast itched. "You better keep one eye on the sky while fishing." Cole brushed some dog fur off his jeans. "And maybe I'd best try and set the tent up in the shadow of the woods." "Agreed," Byron said, "because who knows how big that thing's hunting range is, or how big its appetite is." Later, the river widened into a pond surrounded by boggy marshland. They camped under the trees and sat in the twilight, watching a pair of bluish-white will-o'-the-wisps blink at each other across the bog. "You suppose they work like bug lights?" Cole asked, slapping his arm. "You'd think here in fairyland there might be fewer pests. What kind of a wonderland is this if there are mosquitoes?" "Watch out you don't slap a fairy by mistake," Byron joked. "They probably don't take kindly to that." "Hold on," Cole chuckled. "Remember the giant bug light Dad bought for Grandpa one year? It was like $200 and 120 watts. "Oh yeah," Byron chuckled. "And it shorted out in less than a week." "Yeah," Cole really laughed now, "because a bat flew into it." "I felt bad for the bat," Byron admitted. Okay, but imagine the sparks and the light. It must have been like a transistor blowing. And afterwards, the bat must have been totally fried, like Luke Skywalker's uncle. Here he snorted and had to hold his breath for a moment. "Now, think about what you might accidentally kill with that thing there. That thing here. We'd be lying in the tent and bam! There'd be a huge white blast and maybe a high-pitched squeal and Grandpa would be like, 'Got me another pixie, Grandma!'" Byron started to get into the spirit now, too. He added, in imitation of his grandfather's voice, "Serves those little monsters right, they were hexing my tomatoes." Now, imagine the kind of light you'd need for a cockatrice or a harpy. Or a griffin, you'd basically need a bug lighthouse. And what about the fireworks when it made impact? The two had a good long laugh before bed and forgot their worries and problems for a few moments. Not far into their next 10-hour march, they found their first sign of civilization. Halfway around the pond, in a conifer forest, they ran across a path that led from the woods down to the water's edge. "This seems too well used to be an animal trail," Byron observed, bending to examine it. He picked up some loose sand and ran it through his fingers, emulating a knowledgeable tracker from the movies. As he watched the dirt blow in the wind, he absently wondered why movie trackers always did this. To see the air currents? To get a feel for the ground and how the prints would best be made? It felt absurd. "So what do we do now, Clint Eastwood?" Cole asked, mocking his stance. "Follow it?" "I hate to lose the river," Byron answered, ignoring the jab. He squinted up into the sunlight, and the wind gusted, blowing the sand from his hand. It felt like a Hollywood moment, but it was broken when Harold began to bark, the fur rising up on his shoulders. "Easy," Cole said, reaching for his collar. Byron scanned the area toward which the dog barked and saw what had roused his attention. Through the forest, up the hill, and straight along the path stood a strange-looking creature. It can perhaps best be described as a centaur, but instead of a horse's body, it had the body of a small goat. Coming off that, and the size of a child, was a torso that looked to Byron like it belonged to a goblin from Labyrinth. Pinkish skin, wild hair, pointed ears, and an unpleasant expression. It had 2 curving horns sprouting from its temples, and it held a small spear. "What is that thing?" Byron asked aloud. Harold broke free, sprinting up the path and barking madly. The goblin goat centaur turned and fled. "Harold!" Cole shouted, chasing the dog up the path. "Come back! Harold!" Byron screamed, following. It was no use. The shepherd disappeared over the hill and into the shadowy forest, and the 2 boys, winded, stopped running, leaning on trees for support. They both called out to their dog again, then Cole turned to Byron, his speech interrupted as he gasped for breath. "Now we're in trouble. This isn't a human path, and with our dog chasing it, that fawn isn't going to be happy. What if there's more of them? A village or something? What if Harold kills it? We shouldn't follow this trail. Let's get back to the river." "We can't just leave Harold," Byron replied, setting his face into a determined expression and beginning to walk further along the trail. "Besides, that goat man thing looked too small to be dangerous." "Sure," Cole replied, moving to keep up, "unless there are 20 of them, and it's called a fawn." "No," Byron didn't slow his pace, but he took on an argumentative tone. "A fawn has 2 legs, like Mr. Tumnus. A centaur has 4 legs. This is more like a centaur." "Semantics," Cole replied. "It's half goat, so in my book it's a fawn." "Number of legs matters," Byron insisted doggedly. "It's how we quantify living things. Biped, quadruped, insect, spider, centipede, millipede." "Harold!" Cole yelled again, calling their dog and effectively ending the argument. Byron followed suit. After about 3 minutes, Harold reappeared, cresting the rise and limping back along the trail, his physical demeanor one of weariness. Byron ran ahead and hugged him as he collapsed, panting on the ground. "You gotta stop doing this to us," he chided. A small arrow protruded from Harold's shoulder. Byron pulled it out, and Harold whimpered. "You're okay, bud," Byron soothed, examining the wound. It wasn't deep, but it bled. Cole took off his backpack and set it on the ground. Digging in it for a few minutes, he pulled out a nylon rope and the Swiss Army knife. Cutting off about 10 feet, he looped it through Harold's collar and tied it off. "There," he said, "that should take care of that." "Do you smell smoke?" Byron asked, and as he said it, he thought he heard the faint snapping reports of distant gunfire. "What was that?" Cole asked. "Is that a gun?" It sounded again, 3 more times, and they definitely smelled smoke. Both the sound and the smell came from up the path. "Guns means people, right?" Byron asked. "Probably the British Poindexter kept talking about." "Let me think," Cole said. "The mirror was built in 1837, his eyes unfocused as he did mathematical calculations in his head. It's 1996, so roughly 150 years ago, but time here is 5 times slower than home, so like 30 years? You mean to tell me that if the British are still here, they've only been here for 30 years? Best guess, yeah. Then they're the closest to modern civilization we're likely to get. Oh, I'm thinking the same thing, Cole said. Let's go. He shouldered the pack and walked along the path toward the sounds. Let's keep an eye out for those fawns, he said over his shoulder. They're obviously armed. Byron let the fawn stand this time, but vowed to revisit the point with Cole later. As they moved deeper into the woody hills, the sounds and smells of combat increased. Now, mixed with the burning wood and leaves, they could clearly make out hints of gun smoke, and the spent powder reminded them both of many 4th of July holidays spent with their grandparents on the lake in New York, and of the time they'd gone to see a reenactment of Pickett's Charge with their dad and cousins at Gettysburg. The woods surrounding them looked to Byron like some of the pine groves in old New Hampshire forests. The moist ground sprouted moss and fern, and orange needles littered the forest floor, dotted with long, pitchy cones. There wasn't a lot of cover, except behind tree trunks. He didn't think much more about it before his brother interrupted him. "There's one of them," Cole said. Sure enough, a goblin goat creature moved along the hill line, limping away from them into the woods. Clearly, it had suffered an injury to the hindquarters, and it paid them no heed at all. You think they have a village up ahead and it's under attack? Byron asked. That's exactly what I think, Cole replied. The pace of the gunfire ahead began to slacken. I think it's a bad idea to walk into a war zone. Me too, but I'm definitely planning to sneak up on it and take a peek. You sure? Byron raised his brows questioningly. Stay here if you want, Cole suggested. I'll be careful. Cole edged up to the top of the rise, over which came the snaps and pops and wafting billows of smoke. He lay down parallel to a rotting trunk. After a moment of hesitation, Byron followed, leading Harold. They both snuck a glimpse down the other side. What the? Are those? Cole's mouth hung agape. Fudge Sunday, Byron whispered. Skeletons! Sure enough, down in the forest dell were diminutive wood and thatch huts burned and smoldered, pale-boned skeletons stalked back and forth, gleaming steel-headed spears in hand. With these, they skewered the wounded and dying goat goblins. Each skeleton had a red cross painted across its cranium, red paint on white bone, like the flag of England. At the far side of the village, gathering into a loose formation, stood 7 red-coated British soldiers, complete with white campaign helmets and bayoneted rifles. One raised his gun and fired. A brief flash illuminated the twilight. Beside the soldiers, shifting his feet back and forth and holding a flag on a lance, stood a bugler. Rigid beside him, saber in hand, a tall officer sat upon a dark horse. The flag was the British Union Jack, England's Red Cross of St. George superimposed over the white X of Scotland's St. Andrew's Cross. But instead of the traditional blue background, this flag flew on sable cloth. What do we do now? Byron asked. They've got skeletons, and that flag looks, evil somehow. You want to just walk up and introduce ourselves? I don't know, Cole whispered. They're still our best bet at making another mirror and getting home, but I'm not going to lie, those skeletons creep me out. This reminds me too much of that poster Mom wouldn't let you put up in your room. Iron Maiden, remember? That skeletal British infantryman could give anyone nightmares. Yeah, Cole nodded somberly. I put it up inside my closet. It's burned now, along with everything else. Harold began a low growl deep in his throat. Byron grabbed him by the collar and got in his face. Shut up, bud, he whispered. Then he rubbed Harold's ears to calm him. Cole said, sounding worried. One of them's headed this way. Byron poked his head back over the log, and sure enough, a hollow-eyed skeleton had lifted its Red Cross skull and silently ascended the hill toward their position. Its spear gleamed dangerously in a stray sunbeam that pierced the canopy and the smoke. The boys looked at each other with a start, backed up, stood up, and fled at full sprint into the forest.